Here is what corruption looks like at scale. It doesn't look like a villain in a movie counting cash in a dark room. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like a government contract signed in a conference room in Brasilia. It looks like a wire transfer moving between shell companies in the Cayman Islands and a numbered account in Geneva. It looks like a construction company donating to a political campaign, and that campaign, once elected, awarding that construction company a contract at 3 times the market rate, and the surplus quietly flowing back to the politicians who signed the deal. It looks like a system, and systems, unlike individuals, are very hard to catch.
For decades, something like that system operated at the heart of Brazilian politics and its economy. Not secretly, not in the sense that nobody knew anything was wrong. Brazilians have a word, jeitinho, that describes the art of navigating around rules, of finding the flexible interpretation, the informal arrangement, the private understanding. The corruption that Lava Jato eventually exposed was not a secret in the way that a spy's identity is a secret. It was more like an open secret, the kind of thing that people know and mention in whispers and accommodate themselves to because it seems permanent, because it has always been there, because fighting it seems not just difficult, but pointless.
And then, on March 17, 2014, in the relatively unremarkable southern Brazilian city of Curitiba, a federal judge named Sergio Moro signed the first arrest warrants in an investigation that began, and here is the thing that makes this story almost impossible to believe, at a car wash. Not metaphorically, an actual car wash. A gas station with a car wash attached in the state of Paraná that investigators had identified as a money laundering front for a small-time currency exchange operator named Alberto Youssef. They thought they were investigating one man, one money launderer, one relatively modest operation. They had no idea what they were about to find. When the full shape of Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash, finally became visible, it was not one story. It was dozens of stories, tangled together, stretching across a dozen countries, touching the lives of former presidents, billionaire businessmen, Football Federation officials, construction company executives, and hundreds of politicians from every major political party in Brazil. It was the story of how a nation's wealth, the oil money, the infrastructure budgets, the state contracts worth billions, had been systematically looted for years by a cartel of politicians and corporations so intertwined that separating them was like trying to separate 2 vines that had grown around each other for 20 years. The investigation that started with a car wash would produce over 2,000 criminal charges, over 100 convictions, the imprisonment of a former president who had been one of the most popular leaders in the world, the collapse of the largest construction companies in Latin America, political earthquakes across a continent. It began with a single thread, and the thread went everywhere. To understand Lava Jato, you need to understand Petrobras. Petróleo Brasileiro S.A., Petrobras, is not just an oil company. In Brazil, Petrobras is something closer to a national myth. Founded in 1953 by President Getúlio Vargas as a symbol of Brazilian sovereignty over its own natural resources, the company became the vehicle through which Brazil's oil wealth, including the staggering pre-salt reserves discovered in 2006, some of the largest offshore oil finds in history, was supposed to be channeled into national development. Petrobras was partly state-owned, internationally traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and considered a crown jewel of Brazilian state capitalism. When the pre-salt discoveries were announced, some estimates projected that Petrobras would become one of the largest companies on Earth. It was also, investigators would eventually discover, the engine of the largest corruption scheme in the history of democracy. The mechanics of the scheme, once you understand them, are simultaneously elegant and appalling. Here's how it worked. Petrobras, like all large state enterprises, awarded enormous contracts to construction and engineering companies for infrastructure work, refineries, pipelines, offshore platforms, industrial facilities. These contracts were worth billions. The companies that wanted them were many and well-funded. Standard practice would be for these contracts to go through competitive tendering, an open process in which multiple companies bid, the best bid wins, the public gets value for money. What actually happened was different. The major construction companies, Odebrecht, OAS, Camargo Correa, Andre Gutierrez, and others, had formed a secret cartel. They coordinated their bids, agreed in advance which company would win which contract, and submitted non-competitive bids from the others to create the appearance of competition. The winning company would then inflate the contract value, padding the price by somewhere between 1% and 3% above what the work actually cost. That padding, that surplus extracted from the public purse, became a fund. And from that fund, payments flowed in two directions simultaneously: to Petrobras executives who managed the contracting process and ensured the cartel's bids were selected, and to political parties whose support was necessary to maintain the arrangement. The political dimension was the key. Petrobras was state-controlled, which meant its senior executives were effectively political appointees. The Workers' Party, the PT, which governed Brazil from 2003 under Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and then his successor, Dilma Rousseff, controlled Petrobras's downstream operations directorate. The PMDB, the centrist party whose support Lula and Rousseff needed to maintain their congressional coalition, controlled the engineering and services directorate. The PT and PMDB politicians who held these positions used them to direct contracts to the cartel companies. The cartel companies paid the kickbacks. The kickbacks went to party coffers and personal accounts. It was, in a word, a machine. It had been running for years. By the time investigators began to understand its full scope, they estimated that somewhere between $2 billion and $5 billion had been extracted from Petrobras through this mechanism. Some estimates ran higher. And it had all started to unravel because of a small-time money launderer in Paraná who moved money for Alberto Yusuf, who laundered money for Paulo Roberto Costa, who was the former director of downstream operations at Petrobras, and who one day, sitting across from a federal prosecutor in Curitiba, decided that cooperation was a better option than silence. The decision to talk was the crack in the wall, and what came through that crack changed everything. Every historic investigation needs an architect. For Lava Jato, that architect was federal judge Sergio Moro, a 41-year-old jurist from Maringá, Paraná, who had spent years studying corporate criminal law and who had, before Lava Jato, made a name for himself in Curitiba's federal court with successful prosecutions of money laundering cases that other jurisdictions had declined to pursue. Moro was not a dramatic figure in the Hollywood sense. He was scholarly, methodical, soft-spoken in public. But his approach to the Petrobras investigation was anything but timid. He used a set of investigative tools and legal strategies that, in combination, produced results that Brazil's justice system had almost never produced before: the prosecution and conviction of powerful, well-defended, politically connected defendants. The cornerstone of his approach was the plea agreement, what Brazilians call delação premiada, or rewarded collaboration. Under Brazilian law, defendants who cooperate with investigators and provide information leading to new charges can receive reduced sentences. In most corruption cases, this mechanism had been used sparingly, and defendants with money and lawyers routinely decided that fighting the charges was preferable to cooperation. Moro's innovation, if it can be called that, was to make the alternative to cooperation so unattractive that cooperation became rational. The preventive detention provisions of Brazilian criminal law allowed Moro to jail suspects pending investigation if he could demonstrate flight risk or obstruction of justice risk. In the early phases of Lava Jato, Moro used this provision aggressively. Suspects who refused to cooperate found themselves sitting in the federal police facility in Curitiba, facing a trial date that was years away, while their co-conspirators, who had chosen cooperation, were cutting deals, reducing their exposure, and going home. The message was clear: the longer you wait to talk, the worse your outcome. And it worked with remarkable consistency. Paulo Roberto Costa was the first domino. His cooperation led to Alberto Yusuf, who was a more prolific money launderer than investigators had initially understood.
His networks ran not just through Paraná, but through Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and into the offshore financial system. Youssef's cooperation led to executives at the major construction companies. The construction company executives led to Petrobras directors. Petrobras directors led to politicians. Each layer of cooperation produced a new list of names, a new set of accounts, a new web of transactions that the financial forensics team could trace. The scale of what the forensics teams were finding was staggering. Bank accounts in Switzerland, in the Cayman Islands, in the British Virgin Islands, in Panama. Shell companies layered 3 and 4 deep, each one owned by another shell company in a different jurisdiction, making the beneficial owner nearly impossible to identify without international legal cooperation. Cash payments made in foreign currencies in hotel rooms and airport lounges, luxury apartments purchased in the names of relatives, artworks bought at inflated prices in transactions that functioned as cash transfers in disguise. The investigators were building something unprecedented in Brazilian legal history. An evidentiary record so comprehensive, so cross-corroborated by multiple independent sources, that it would withstand the kind of legal challenge that well-funded defendants with the best lawyers in Brazil would inevitably mount. And the names on that evidentiary record were getting bigger every month. None of them were ready for how big the list was about to get. If Operation Car Wash had a single corporate villain, a company whose story encapsulates everything about how systematic corruption works at scale, it was Odebrecht SA. Odebrecht was not just a construction company. By 2014, it was the largest construction and engineering conglomerate in Latin America, with revenues approaching $40 billion annually. Operations in 28 countries, and a portfolio that included some of the most ambitious infrastructure projects on the continent. Highways, airports, hospitals, dams, stadiums, oil refineries, nuclear power plants. The company had been founded in 1944 in Salvador, Bahia, by Emilio Odebrecht, and had been built across 3 generations into something that functioned as a state within the state. An organization with its own intelligence apparatus, its own legal department of extraordinary sophistication, its own network of political contacts that stretched from Brasilia to Buenos Aires to Luanda to Washington. What investigators discovered after years of piecing together evidence from cooperating witnesses, financial records, and the company's own internal communications was that Odebrecht had an entire dedicated department referred to internally as the Setor de Operações Estruturadas, or Structured Operations Division, whose sole purpose was to manage bribery payments to government officials and politicians across every country where the company operated. This was not an informal arrangement managed by a few corrupt executives. It was a bureaucracy. It had a budget, a staff, a director, an accounting system, and internal controls designed to ensure that bribes were paid accurately and on time. The division operated through a network of offshore accounts and financial intermediaries, what one former executive described as a financial drainpipe running from Odebrecht's legitimate operations to a parallel financial system entirely dedicated to corruption. The division maintained its own encrypted communication system, called Drosis, which was used to communicate about bribe payments in terms designed to be opaque if discovered. Payments were called services, recipients were identified by code names, and the accounts used were structured specifically to resist forensic tracing. When federal prosecutors in the United States, working in parallel with Brazilian investigators, eventually reached a settlement with Odebrecht in December 2016, the Department of Justice called it the largest foreign bribery resolution in history. Odebrecht admitted to paying approximately $788 million in bribes to government officials and politicians in 12 countries. The actual number, investigators believe, was significantly higher. This was what they could prove. The DOJ statement, extraordinary in its directness, noted that Odebrecht had paid bribes to officials in Brazil, Angola, Argentina, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Mozambique, Panama, Peru, and Venezuela. Not a region, a continent, with specific line items. The settlement produced something even more valuable than fines. It produced cooperation. Odebrecht executives who became cooperating witnesses provided Brazilian and international investigators with a map, detailed, documented, specific, of exactly who had received what, when, and through which channels. The list of names that emerged from Odebrecht's cooperation files became one of the most explosive documents in the history of Latin American politics.
Brazil's former president Michel Temer, former presidents of Peru, Ecuador, and Panama, sitting governors, ministers, congressional leaders, the treasurer of the Workers' Party, the treasurer of the PSDB, the treasurer of the PMDB. Every major political party in Brazil, every major political figure in several other countries. The bribe spreadsheet read like a who's who of Latin American power. And the number at the center of the entire structure, the name that the investigation had been circling for months, that everyone in Brazil knew was coming, that the country had been holding its breath about, was about to appear. His name was Lula.
Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was not just a former president of Brazil. He was a phenomenon.
Born into poverty in the drought-ravaged Northeast, one of 8 children who walked barefoot and sold peanuts on the streets of Sao Paulo as a child, Lula had become a steelworker, then a union leader, then a political prisoner under Brazil's military dictatorship, then the founder of the Workers' Party, then a 3-time presidential candidate before finally winning in 2002 in what was widely celebrated as a triumph of Brazilian democracy. The son of the poor, elected to lead the country that had kept his class down for centuries. His presidency, from 2003 to 2010, presided over an extraordinary period of Brazilian growth. Commodity prices were high, the pre-salt oil discoveries were announced, and social programs like Bolsa Familia lifted tens of millions of Brazilians out of extreme poverty. When he left office in 2010, Lula had an approval rating of 87%. Barack Obama called him the most popular politician on earth. He was the kind of figure whose story felt larger than politics, a validation of the idea that democracy could produce genuine social transformation.
And then, the investigators started looking at a triplex apartment in the coastal city of Guarujá. The apartment, a 3-story penthouse unit in a beachfront residential building called Solaris, had been renovated by OAS, one of the major construction companies implicated in the Petrobras cartel. The renovation was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The investigation's question was simple: who paid for those renovations, and who was the apartment for? The evidence that prosecutors assembled painted a specific picture. OAS had effectively purchased and renovated the apartment as a benefit for Lula. In exchange, OAS had received favorable treatment in Petrobras contracting decisions during Lula's presidency. The renovations were a bribe, disguised as construction work on a property that Lula's family effectively used but technically did not own. Lula denied it. His lawyers attacked the evidence with every available tool. They challenged the characterization of the apartment's ownership. They disputed the valuation of the renovations. They argued that the cooperating witnesses who had testified against him were motivated by self-interest and could not be trusted. They challenged the jurisdiction of the Curitiba court, arguing that the case should have been heard in Brasilia. Moro convicted him anyway. In July 2017, Lula was convicted of passive corruption and money laundering, sentenced to 9.5 years in prison. The conviction was upheld by a 3-judge appellate panel. A second conviction followed in a separate case involving a country house in Atibaia. His prison sentence grew. In April 2018, after legal appeals had been exhausted to a critical threshold, Lula walked into the federal police headquarters in Sao Paulo and surrendered. The scenes outside the building, thousands of supporters weeping, chanting, holding banners, counter-protesters celebrating, captured the extent to which Lava Jato had become not just a legal proceeding, but a political rupture. Brazil had not experienced anything like it. The most popular president in the country's democratic history, in prison, convicted of accepting a bribe that consisted of a renovated apartment worth less than $1 million, in a scheme that, by comparison, had moved billions. The disproportion between the symbolic weight of Lula's imprisonment and the specific transaction he had been convicted of was not lost on his supporters, who argued that Moro had prosecuted Lula with particular zealotry, that the charges were selective, and that the real purpose of the prosecution was to prevent Lula from running in the 2018 presidential election, which he was leading in every poll at the time of his arrest. That argument would, in time, acquire evidence that made it not just a political talking point, but a serious legal challenge. Brazil was burning, but the fire had already jumped the border. Odebrecht's cooperation with investigators had produced something that went far beyond Brazil's domestic political crisis. The company's bribery records, specific, documented, time-stamped, showed that the same mechanics of corruption that had looted Petrobras in Brazil had been replicated, with local variations, across every country where Odebrecht had built infrastructure projects.
In Peru, the damage was total. 3 former presidents, Alejandro Toledo, Ollanta Humala, and Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, were either charged, arrested, or placed under investigation for receiving bribes from Odebrecht. A 4th, Alan Garcia, died by suicide in April 2019 as police arrived at his home to arrest him. The story of Peru's involvement was particularly striking because Toledo, the president who had originally granted Odebrecht its first major Peruvian contracts, allegedly received approximately $20 million in bribes routed through a shell company operated by a friend in Israel. He fled the country and spent years fighting extradition from the United States, where he had taken refuge.
In Ecuador, former President Rafael Correa and several members of his government were implicated in Odebrecht bribery payments related to infrastructure contracts signed during his administration. Correa, who had positioned himself as a leftist firebrand and vocal critic of corruption, was convicted in absentia on separate charges of bribery and sentenced to 8 years in prison, a sentence he could not serve because he had relocated to Belgium. In Panama, former President Ricardo Martinelli was investigated in connection with bribes allegedly paid by Odebrecht on an infrastructure project. In the Dominican Republic, prosecutors charged former officials with receiving Odebrecht money. In Colombia, the National Infrastructure Agency admitted that officials had received bribes on highway projects. In Mexico, an energy company with ties to Odebrecht was investigated for payments to government officials connected to state oil company contracts. In Venezuela, Angola, and Mozambique, investigations were opened and then, in some cases, quietly closed because the governments of those countries had decided that the outcomes of a full investigation would be politically too dangerous to permit. The pattern that emerged across all of these countries was consistent enough to constitute a system. Odebrecht, and to a lesser but still significant extent, other Brazilian construction companies, had brought Brazilian corruption technology to new markets. The offshore shell company infrastructure, the encrypted communications, the dedicated bribery departments, these were exportable tools. When Odebrecht moved into a new country and won a government contract, the bribery mechanism moved with it. What this meant at the level of continental politics was staggering. The infrastructure that Latin America built in the 2000s, the highways, airports, stadiums, power plants constructed during the commodity boom years, had been built with money that included systematic kickbacks. The public had paid inflated prices. The excess had enriched a class of politicians and executives who had then used their wealth and influence to perpetuate the system. The roads were real, the corruption was real, and the two were inseparable. The Inter-American Development Bank, which had financed many of these projects, launched its own investigations. International banks that had extended credit to Odebrecht and its competitor companies faced embarrassing questions about what due diligence they had done and what they had known. The Swiss financial authorities, who had received mutual legal assistance requests from Brazilian prosecutors, began cooperating at a level that Swiss banking secrecy had historically made impossible.
The world was watching, and the world was learning that what had looked from outside like Latin America's development miracle had had a price tag that was never publicly disclosed.
But even as the international ramifications of Lava Jato were becoming clear,
something was happening inside Brazil that would complicate the story in ways nobody had predicted. While Lula was fighting his legal battles in Curitiba, his successor, Dilma Rousseff, was fighting a different kind of battle in Brasilia and losing it. Rousseff, a former Marxist guerrilla who had been tortured under the military dictatorship and had served as Lula's chief of staff and energy minister before being chosen as his chosen successor, had won 2 presidential elections and governed Brazil through an increasingly turbulent period from 2011 to 2016. She was not personally implicated in the Petrobras corruption scheme. Investigators found no evidence that Rousseff had personally received bribes. But she had been Petrobras's board chair during part of the period when the corruption was occurring, and the question of what she knew and when she knew it was never fully resolved. What removed her from office was something different. In 2016, Brazil's Congress voted to impeach Rousseff on charges of fiscal responsibility violations, specifically that she had used accounting maneuvers to disguise the size of the fiscal deficit before the 2014 elections. These were genuine violations of Brazilian budget law. Whether they rose to the level of impeachable offenses was a matter of fierce legal and political debate. Many of the congressmen who voted to impeach her were themselves under investigation in Lava Jato proceedings. The Speaker of the lower house who managed the impeachment process was subsequently convicted of corruption. The President of the Senate who oversaw the trial was convicted of corruption. The spectacle of people facing corruption charges voting to remove a president on corruption-adjacent grounds was not missed by observers. Her replacement, Michel Temer, was a 75-year-old PMDB veteran who had been Rousseff's vice president and who wasted no time in demonstrating that his election to the presidency via her removal was the worst-kept secret in Brazilian politics. Within months of taking office, Temer was himself caught on tape, apparently discussing the payment of hush money to Eduardo Cunha, the former Speaker of the lower house who had managed Rousseff's impeachment and who was now in prison, convicted on Lava Jato charges, and apparently in a position to implicate others if he chose to speak. The recording was published by the newspaper O Globo in May 2017, producing what became known as the JBS scandal, named for the meatpacking billionaire Josley Batista, who had made the recording while cooperating with federal prosecutors. The recording was one of the most dramatic moments in the entire Lava Jato saga, a sitting president apparently authorizing payments to keep a jailed co-conspirator silent, captured in his own words, broadcast to the entire country. Temer denied it. He fought the charges. He survived an impeachment vote, partly because a significant number of congressmen calculated that removing a second president in 2 years would be destabilizing, and partly because Temer's allies moved quickly to negotiate political arrangements that secured the votes he needed. He finished his term. He was subsequently arrested after leaving office on separate corruption charges, and then released. The sequence: Rousseff impeached, Lula imprisoned, Temer implicated, the Workers' Party, the PMDB, and the PSDB, all simultaneously enmeshed in Lava Jato proceedings, produced a political environment that felt to many Brazilians like the complete delegitimization of the political class as a whole. Every major party, every major figure. The corruption, it turned out, was not the property of any particular ideology. It was the property of power itself. And into that void, that crisis of confidence in every existing institution, walked a man who had spent years positioning himself as the one politician who stood outside the corrupted system. His name was Jair Bolsonaro, and Lava Jato had made him possible. Here is the part of the story that the investigators didn't plan for, that nobody planned for. The part where the cure produced its own disease.
Jair Bolsonaro had been a fringe congressman from Rio de Janeiro for nearly 3 decades before Lava Jato. A former army captain, vocally nostalgic for the military dictatorship,
known primarily for a series of inflammatory statements about women, Black Brazilians, LGBT people, and indigenous communities that would have ended the career of any politician operating in a normal political environment. He had served 7 terms in Congress without passing a single piece of significant legislation. He was not, by any serious analysis, a major political figure. And then Lava Jato tore the Brazilian political establishment apart.
The thing about the Lava Jato prosecutions was that they were not perceived by a significant portion of the Brazilian public through the lens of justice and accountability. They were perceived through the lens of rage. For many Brazilians, particularly those who had never trusted the Workers' Party, who had watched Brazil's economy deteriorate under Rousseff's final years, who felt that the social contract had been broken by a class of politicians who had taken the country's oil money and spent it on themselves, Lava Jato was not a legal process. It was a reckoning. And the desire for that reckoning had an emotional temperature that was difficult to contain within legal channels.
Bolsonaro positioned himself as the man who existed outside all of it. He had no connections to Petrobras, to Odebrecht, to the Workers' Party networks. Not because he was particularly honest, but because he had never been powerful enough to participate. His fringe status, which had been a political disadvantage for 30 years, became an asset in an environment where every established figure had been tainted. He was different, loud, unpolished, provocative in ways that felt, to his supporters, like authenticity. He championed Sergio Moro publicly, wearing t-shirts with Moro's face on them, calling Lava Jato the greatest anti-corruption initiative in Brazilian history. He built his 2018 presidential campaign on the ruins of public faith in every other political option. And he won. He won the presidency of Brazil in October 2018 with 55% of the vote, in an election that would not have been possible without the political vacuum that Lava Jato had created.
What happened next was one of the more remarkable political reversals in recent democratic history.
Bolsonaro appointed Sergio Moro as his Minister of Justice, a decision that was immediately criticized as confirmation that Moro's prosecution of Lula had been politically motivated, designed to clear the electoral field for Bolsonaro by keeping Lula imprisoned and off the ballot. Moro accepted, insisting that his appointment was evidence of a genuine partnership in the fight against corruption. The partnership did not last. In April 2020, Moro resigned from Bolsonaro's cabinet, publicly accusing the president of political interference in federal police investigations, specifically of attempting to replace the federal police director in order to protect family members from investigation. His resignation statement was extraordinary. A former judge who had prosecuted dozens of politicians for corruption was now accusing the president he had joined of corruption. The symmetry was almost too perfect. Bolsonaro's relationship with Lava Jato then turned decisively hostile. His government took steps that critics argued were designed to weaken the investigation's institutional foundations. He appointed a new attorney general who was seen as more sympathetic to the targets of Lava Jato than his predecessor. He publicly attacked prosecutors involved in the cases. And then, in 2021, the Supreme Court delivered the bombshell that Lula's supporters had been demanding for years. The court ruled that Sergio Moro had not been impartial. March 2021, the Brazilian Supreme Court, in a 3-2 decision, rules that Sergio Moro was biased against Lula in his handling of the corruption cases. The court finds that Moro had coordinated with prosecutors during the investigation in ways that violated Lula's right to an impartial judge. Specifically, that he had provided strategic advice to the prosecution team about how to handle the case, and had shared information about Lula's planned testimony before it was given, allowing prosecutors to adjust their strategy accordingly. The practical effect of the ruling is immediate. Lula's convictions are annulled. The evidence had not changed. The testimony had not changed. The facts of the Petrobras scheme had not changed. What had changed was the procedural status of the judge who convicted him. And Brazilian law, like most legal systems built on due process principles, holds that a conviction delivered by a biased judge cannot stand, regardless of the evidence. Lula walked out of jail, His political rights were restored. The path to the 2022 presidential election was open. The reaction split Brazil cleanly in half. For Lula's supporters, and for critics of the investigation, the Supreme Court ruling was vindication of everything they had argued, that Lava Jato had been not just a corruption investigation, but a political operation, that Moro's appointment as Bolsonaro's minister had been the final proof of what his real agenda had been, and that Lula had been unjustly imprisoned to prevent him from winning an election he would have won. For Lava Jato's supporters, and for many of the people who had built the investigation, the ruling was a catastrophe. Not because Lula was necessarily innocent, but because the annulment of his convictions on procedural grounds appeared to make the decade-long investigation functionally irreversible in its most politically significant dimension. They argued that the Supreme Court had selectively applied procedural standards to the highest-profile defendant in a way it had not applied to less prominent ones. They argued that the bias found in Moro's communications was the kind of informal coordination that routinely occurs in complex white-collar criminal investigations and had been treated as unprecedented only because it involved Lula.
Both arguments had substance. The Brazilian legal and academic communities produced extensive analyses supporting each position. The Supreme Court's ruling was not, in the view of many legal scholars, frivolous. Moro's communications with the prosecution team did reflect conduct that fell below the standards expected of an impartial judge. Whether those communications were egregious enough to invalidate years of independent evidentiary work was genuinely debatable.
What was not debatable was the effect on Lava Jato as an institution. The investigation, which had already seen its dedicated task force in Curitiba dissolved by the federal prosecutor's office in 2021, was now associated in public discourse with both its genuine achievements, hundreds of corruption convictions, billions recovered, systemic exposure of a continental corruption network, and with the allegation that its most famous prosecution had been politically weaponized. These two realities existed simultaneously and could not be disentangled. And then, in October 2022, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was elected president of Brazil for the third time. Let's step back from the political drama for a moment and look at what Lava Jato actually accomplished. Not in the simplified version, either the greatest anti-corruption effort in history or a political witch hunt. The honest version, the complex, uncomfortable, necessary version. Operation Car Wash produced results that, in the first decade of the 21st century, would have seemed impossible in Brazil. Over 170 convictions, sentences totaling thousands of years in aggregate, though most were not fully served, given Brazil's relatively generous appellate and early release mechanisms. Recovery of over $1 billion in assets, the exposure and partial dismantling of the Petrobras cartel, the collapse of Odebrecht as a major construction empire. The company went through one of the largest restructurings in Brazilian corporate history, shedding assets, losing international contracts, and eventually reorganizing under a new corporate structure. The construction cartel that had been looting Petrobras for years was broken. The companies that had participated, OAS, Camargo Correa, Andrade Gutierrez, were fined, restructured, lost access to government contracts. Executives who had been untouchable went to prison. For the first time in Brazilian legal history, wealth and political connections were demonstrably insufficient to prevent a serious federal corruption prosecution. That is real. It matters. It changed the calculus for corporate executives and politicians who, before Lava Jato, had reasonable grounds to believe that the legal system could not reach them. The knowledge that cooperation could be compelled, that offshore accounts could be traced, that encrypted communications could be decrypted. This knowledge changed behavior in ways that are difficult to quantify, but are real. But here's what Lava Jato didn't do. It didn't produce lasting institutional reform. The specific laws, the investigative techniques, the interagency cooperation frameworks that had made Lava Jato possible, these were not codified into durable institutions that would outlast the investigation itself. The political class that had survived the investigation, and a remarkable number had survived it, either through legal victories, political immunity, or simple attrition of prosecutorial will, had learned from it. They had learned what to encrypt, who not to work with, how to structure financial arrangements in ways that created one more layer of deniability.
The systemic roots of Brazilian corruption, the campaign finance system that made politicians structurally dependent on corporate money, the parliamentary coalition management practices that required buying congressional support with favors and appointments, the regulatory framework that made government contracts so opaque and so profitable that the incentive to corrupt them was near irresistible, those roots had not been addressed. They were still there. They were arguably better protected now that the political class had seen what aggressive prosecution looked like and had taken measures accordingly.
The Petrobras corruption scheme, at its height, was extracting between 1 and 3% from every major government contract. That sounds like a small number until you multiply it across an economy of $2 trillion. At that scale, corruption is not a tax on development. It is a fundamental distortion of the economy, redirecting capital from productive investment into private enrichment, degrading the quality of public infrastructure, and systematically undermining the trust between citizens and the state that democratic governance requires to function.
Lava Jato disrupted that system. It did not transform it. And the question of whether transformation is even possible within the existing structure of Brazilian political economy is the question that the story has been building toward from the very beginning. Here is what $1 billion in stolen public money actually means when you translate it from finance into human life.
In Brazil's northeast, the region where Lula was born, the region that voted for him most consistently, the region that Petrobras was supposed to transform with its oil wealth, there are hospitals that were built with inflated contracts and equipped with medical devices that were purchased through kickback schemes. The devices are there. Some of them don't work. Some of them were never properly maintained because the maintenance contracts were also inflated, and the people who should have been monitoring them were part of the arrangement. Children die of preventable conditions in these hospitals.
There are highways whose construction costs were padded by the Petrobras cartel, built with materials whose specifications were sometimes quietly downgraded to maintain margins that deteriorate faster than they should and require repair sooner than projected. The repair contracts are also awarded. The cycle continues.
There are schools that were never built because the money earmarked for them was redirected. There are water treatment facilities that were promised and delayed because the officials responsible for the contracts were managing their own financial interests alongside the public interest. There are communities in the Amazon and the Sertone that don't have electricity, despite the billions that flowed through Petrobras and its contractors, because the money that should have built the grid ended up in an offshore account in the Cayman Islands.
The human cost of systematic political corruption is not abstract. It is measured in life expectancy, in child mortality, in access to clean water, in the quality of public education. The economists who study this connection have found robust relationships between corruption levels and development outcomes that are not surprising, but are consistently underemphasized in the political narratives about corruption as a legal or moral failure. It is a development failure. It is a health failure. It is a failure of every system that exists to translate public resources into public welfare.
Lava Jato, for all its flaws and complications and political weaponization, was an attempt to interrupt that failure. It succeeded in interrupting it. It did not end it. The question of why systematic corruption is so durable, why it survives investigations, why it reconstitutes itself, why the systems designed to prevent it are so consistently outmaneuvered, is not primarily a legal question. It is a question about incentives, about the structure of power, about what happens when the people who write the rules also benefit from the rules being written the way they are. In Brazil, as in most countries where grand corruption has taken root, the political system that corruption exploits is also the political system that would need to be reformed to prevent corruption.
The politicians who would need to vote for campaign finance reform are the same politicians whose campaigns are financed by the companies that benefit from the current arrangement. The regulators who would need to strengthen oversight of government contracts are appointed by the politicians whose allies benefit from weak oversight. The judges who adjudicate corruption cases operate within a legal framework designed by legislators who had interests in that framework being calibrated a certain way.
This is not a Brazilian problem. This is a structural problem that Brazil's experience illustrates with unusual clarity and documentary detail.
Sergio Moro, the man who started it all, the judge who signed the first arrest warrants in Curitiba in March 2014, attempted to enter politics himself. After resigning from Bolsonaro's cabinet, he ran for the Senate in 2022, won, and is now a senator in the same Congress that Lava Jato spent a decade investigating. He ran for president in 2022 and lost in the primary. Lula, the man he convicted, is president again.
Alberto Youssef, the money launderer at the car wash in Paraná, whose cooperation first cracked the case open, was released from prison and has spoken publicly about his experience. Paulo Roberto Costa, the Petrobras director whose cooperation gave the investigation its initial momentum into the company's highest levels, also served a reduced sentence. Odebrecht, now operating under the restructured name Novanor, still exists. It is smaller, chastened, and operating under the conditions of its leniency agreement, but it is still building things in Brazil. The car wash itself, the actual physical gas station and car wash in Paraná, where the investigation's name came from, is still there. It's a normal business. People wash their cars there.
And somewhere in the architecture of Brazilian politics, in the offshore accounts not yet discovered, in the shell companies not yet traced, in the contracts not yet audited, the system is adjusting, learning, reconstituting.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share this channel for more interesting stuff like this.